So it was kind of a funny week for me this week. I started thinking about something I haven't thought about in a long time. Dunkin' Donuts. I don't eat a lot of donuts anymore. As you guys know, I used to be pretty substantially overweight, and getting rid of donuts helped that a great deal, it turns out. But I think probably driving by the construction we have in town where they're putting up a new Dunkin' Donuts made me think about Dunkin' Donuts. And it kind of reminded me that back when I used to live down in New York, my work would actually bring me up to New England a lot. And of course, I knew Dunkin' Donuts because they're all up and down the eastern coast. But man, New England's got Dunkin' Donuts, right? Like in New England, Dunkin' Donuts are like part of the landscape. In fact, it was actually funny to me is that there was a guy I worked with quite a bit who had grown up in Massachusetts. And I said to him, I was like, man, you guys got like Dunkin' Donuts everywhere. He goes, yeah, you know what? Ask anyone for a set of directions. It will include a Dunkin' Donuts. Go up to the Dunkin' Donuts, take a right, right? Or drive about a mile, you'll see a Dunkin' Donuts on the left. 2 more doors down, that's what you're looking for. And so I thought about that, that Dunkin' Donuts is something that's actually been around for a really long time. And for me, when I was younger, it was kind of neat because when I was in high school, during the summer, I would actually have kind of 3 separate jobs. And so I was often kind of running from one job to the next. And sometimes what would happen in my kind of scrambling from one job to the next, I would actually get to the next job a little bit early. And my evening job was actually located next to a Dunkin' Donuts. So if I had an extra like 10 or 15 minutes, what I liked is I could go in, grab a cup of coffee, get a donut. And the cool thing is that the older Dunkin' Donuts were really set up so you could sit down inside them as well and kind of relax inside there. So for me, I thought that was really a great aspect of Dunkin' Donuts, and I have really good memories about those sort of things. But what I noticed is over the years, Dunkin' Donuts started to change. In fact, it's not Dunkin' Donuts anymore, is it? It's Dunkin' now, right? And why did they do that? Why did they make that change? Well, they began to adapt their business model, right? That over time, they started to add some new things. One of my favorites, of course, was Munchkins. When they added Munchkins, that was pretty cool. I liked that. And then he added bagels and breakfast sandwiches, and those things were kind of neat. But then they started doing stuff that was kind of strange to me. Like when they started adding culottes. I have no idea what a culotta is, but apparently they're very popular. And it's funny, as getting ready for this message, I actually went online and looked at the menu, and there's something called a cookie dough swirl macchiato. No idea what that is. And the other thing that they did that was kind of, that I didn't really like very much, I didn't think was a good decision, was they shifted away from this kind of a place to sit down to a place to drive through. Now, there are still seats, but if you look at newly built Dunkin's, there's a few seats, but the whole place is optimized around drive-through. And I thought about that for a while. Like, why are they doing all this? Why are they making all these changes? And of course, the answer is that the world around them was changing. That what people wanted was changing. The way they connect with the people where they have been placed is changing. And so they had a choice. They could keep sticking to doing just what they always did, which eventually wouldn't work anymore, or they could add to what they were doing and incorporate things that connected with what people were looking for in this kind of new world that they were in. And at first, I didn't like that either. But then I realized, as long as they are doing those sort of things, they are succeeding and they are growing. And in that, if I want a coffee and a donut, the traditional thing that I like, I can still go get it because they still have coffee and donuts. They just do these other things too so that they can reach more people and be strong. So today, as we continue our series, Crossed Wires, what I want to talk about is keep the change. Now, keep the change is a phrase that can have a few different meanings. I know many times when I was in Dunkin' Donuts, after I would buy whatever I would buy, it'd be keep the change, right? Just as a way to leave a tip. But organizationally, there are 2 ways to look at that phrase, keep the change. One way to do it is keep the change away from me. I never want to change. I always want to do exactly what I've been doing. Or there's keep the change. Successful organizations look at the world around them constantly and keep the change as part of who they are. They keep adding things and adapting to meet the world around them. So as we go through this series, remember that our common theme here is that as we look at some of the things that Jesus says, we know that sometimes the things he says are confusing or maybe just aren't immediately clear, and it causes us to get our wires crossed, saying that, what is he trying to talk about? But as we talked about last week, is that if we look more closely, we can look a little deeper, and we can see that there are really powerful messages in there. So the question comes up is, what does Jesus say about how his followers should view change? How does he say we should look at change? How should we look at the world around us as it's changing, and how should we deal with that? But I think what we'll find is that on the surface, that's not immediately clear. But looking more closely, we can actually see that he tells us something very distinct about change. Now, we're going to use two parables to do this. We're going to look at the parable we talked about last week again a little bit. We're going to talk about another parable after that. Now, remember that last week's parable was called the parable of the shrewd manager. Remember, that parable was about a wealthy employer who had a manager working for him, and that manager misused his resources. And as a result, the manager was fired. But remember what the employer did. He says, well, before you go, get all your books in order, get everything in order, turn it over to me, and you're gone. And of course, the manager realizes that, well, if I make my living managing other people's resources, and if word gets out that I mismanaged resources, no one else is going to hire me. So I need to make some friends, and I need to make them quick. So what did he do? He used the resources he had access to, looked at what people around him needed, found a way to connect with them, and he created relationships by doing that. And the thing that's kind of funny is that although we look at this mismanagement of resources, and we would expect Jesus to condemn what the manager did, he didn't. How does the parable end? It says the rich man had to admire the dishonest rascal for being so shrewd. So he looks at what the manager did as being shrewd. He doesn't condemn it. Now, does that tell us anything about how we should view change? On the surface, it probably doesn't. But if we actually, I think if we look at this other parable and then put the two together, we'll see exactly what Jesus says about change. So the other parable I want to look at is actually probably one of the most well-known parables that Jesus told. It's called the parable of the lost son, or commonly known as the prodigal son. And it's a story about a wealthy father who has two sons, an older son and a younger son. And as the father deals with his sons, one of his sons makes an unusual request to him. Now remember, as we talked about last week, whenever Jesus tells these parables, you remember all a parable is a fictional story that has a lesson, right? Like a fable, that sort of thing. That we know that whenever the character is a wealthy landowner, a wealthy employer, anything like that, that character represents God. And then whoever the other main character is meant to connect with the listener. Now in this case, there are two other main characters because there are two sons, the older son and the younger son, which basically means that Jesus was speaking to two audiences at the same time. And remember that in this story, if you've heard the story before, you know the big thing is that normally in this culture, sons would have great respect for their fathers. But what happened here is that the youngest son basically decides that, you know what, I want to live my own life. But in order to live my own life, I'm going to need some cash to do that. Well, Dad, when you die, I'm supposed to get a bunch of money. But I don't want to wait anymore. So what I want you to do is figure out how much money I would get when you die and give it to me now. And surprisingly, in the parable, the father actually agrees to do that. So he actually calculates what would be the inheritance for the younger son and gives him all of those resources. So now as Jesus continues, he tells us, a few days later, the younger son packed all his belongings and moved to a distant land. And there he wasted all his money on wild living. About the time his money ran out, a great famine swept over the land, and he began to starve. So the younger son had all these kind of great expectations for all the cool things he was going to be able to do. But in no time at all, he ran out of money. And then he got kind of a double hit, is that he mishandled his resources, but then he gets hit with a surprise. Things go wrong, a famine kicks in. And suddenly this combination of the choices that he's made, along with the current situation, finds that he's now being crushed under the weight of that combination. He now finds that not only are things hard, but he's literally starving and he is struggling to survive. That he's basically realizing that the way he viewed his life working is not what's happening. Life is not working right now the way he thought. So he finally decides what he really wants to do is go back home. But in that culture, because of the way he treated his father had every right to consider him dead. So basically, by acting that way, he'd given up his rights as a son. So he couldn't justifiably go back to his father and say, please let me back into the family. But what he realizes is that, the people who work for my dad live way better than I'm living right now. So I'll go back to my father and say, you know what? I have no right to be your son, but would you at least just give me a job? Would you just hire me on as a hired hand? So he does that. He heads home. And when he gets home, he's all ready to give this speech to his father about how I've wronged you. I have no right to be your son. Could you just give me a job? But what does his dad do? His dad doesn't hear any of that, right? His dad just says, welcome home. Come in. I am so glad you came back. And in fact, the father is not just happy that he came back, he actually throws this huge party to welcome him, and lots of food, invites everyone into the town, big loud music. And basically, he's just showing that you're welcome back home even with your mistakes. And what we find is that this is the part of the story where we tend to focus. And it's a great place for us to focus, because the point is, what Jesus is pointing out here is the unending mercy and grace of God, that no matter what your mistakes are, you are welcome. No matter what you've done, you are welcome into the family. And if that's your story, embrace that truth. If your story is like the son's story, embrace that truth that God wants that relationship with you. But what if that isn't your story? What if you're a person who's consistently gone to church for years, who's maintained that relationship with God for years, and the story of the younger son doesn't really connect with you? Does that mean there's nothing in this parable for you? There's nothing in this parable for us who are in church this morning, even though it's hot and humid and together. Well, remember that there are two brothers, and we haven't even gotten to the older brother yet. Because it turns out that the older brother was actually out working in the fields when the younger brother returned. And no one even bothers to tell him that his brother has come back. So he goes out working for the whole day. He comes in and he hears music coming from inside the house. And he actually has to kind of track down one of the servants and say, what's going on? And they go, oh yeah, your brother who took everything from your father and ran away? Well, he's back, and your dad's celebrating the fact that he's back. So, with the younger brother home, the older brother could go two ways. He could be really angry at his brother, or he could be happy that his brother is at least back home. Well, it turns out he's not happy. Because as Jesus continues to tell the story, the older brother was angry and wouldn't go in, so he wouldn't even go into the house. The father actually had to come out and beg him to please come back into the house. Please welcome your brother. And the older brother will have nothing to do with that. The older brother will not go talk to his younger brother. He's not willing to welcome him in. He's not willing to have anything to do with his younger brother. And what I find interesting here is that the younger brother didn't do anything to harm the older brother. The older brother will still get his inheritance just like he's supposed to. The person that was harmed was the father. Yet, even though the harm was on the father was completely happy to welcome him home. He was just glad that he came back. But what his father was so happy to do, the older brother wasn't even willing to do. He would not even consider it. In fact, he basically is just furious to the point that even as his father begs, he will not go in, he will not acknowledge his brother. Now the question is, why is he so angry like this? Again, he wasn't harmed by what his brother did. Well, as Jesus continues the story, he says, well, the older brother replied, all these years I have slaved for you, and I never once refused to do a single thing you told me to. And in all that time, you never gave me even one young goat for a feast with my friends. So what's the older brother's problem? He's jealous. I was here all the time. I was always working for you. I was always faithful to you. And you didn't give me anything special. This guy goes off and lives like that, and you welcome him back, and you throw him a party? He shouldn't be getting special treatment. People who act like that should not get special treatment. But me, the older brother, because of my loyalty to you, I should be the focus of your attention. And he kind of goes on and basically says, those who haven't been here should not be getting focused. Those of us who stayed are where all the attention should go. All those of us who are loyal are where all the attention should go. So basically, he's upset because the one who was lost is welcomed back. Because he feels like because he stayed, all the energy should go in to what he wants. And basically, he feels like the attention should be on him. But now, a question that comes up. Does the father loving and caring for the younger brother means he loves the older brother any less? Right? That's kind of the neat thing about when it comes to love, right? When you love more people, your love grows. It doesn't get subtractive. It gets bigger. And God's love, I always call God's math, right? Is that the love of God just embraces more and more people. And the more people we bring together into that love, the more we become aware of that love. And as the father tries to point out to the older brother that your brother was lost, he's back. That needs to be about happiness. In fact, what the father says is, we had to celebrate this happy day. For your brother was dead and has come back to life. He was lost, but now he is found. So pointing out the need to celebrate and connect those who return, or maybe those who have never been here, is what he's really focused on. And looking at this parable, those in the first century who heard it would have seen something that may not be obvious to us. Remember that the older brother would actually be the firstborn son. And in that culture, the firstborn son was actually a very important role in the family, because when the father died, the one who would take over responsibility for the family would be the firstborn son. And that wasn't something that just happened instantly when the day the dad died. That was something he would have been prepared for, that he would be part of caring for the family. As he got older, he would be taking increasing responsibility for the family. So what that means is he is responsible to try to keep the family together, to try to keep the family strong. Which means what he should have done when his younger brother went away, he should have looked for opportunities to connect with him, to find him. Now, doesn't mean he should drag him back. I mean, people make their own choices and they have to live with their choices. But the older brother should have just checked in on him from time to time to see if there might have been a moment where they could connect again and then maybe invite him back into the family. That's what the older brother should have been doing. And the lesson for us who are in the church is that we should do what the older brother should have been doing. Our responsibility is to identify how we can connect to the people around us. How do we connect to the world around us? How do we grow the family of God? How do we share this love that we know, the people who don't know that love? And the people who may have used to have been here and have fallen away, or those who have never been here. That's our responsibility, because we are like the older brother in this situation. And that's what Jesus wants us to do. He wants us to help people to connect with the Father, to help people to connect with God. Because we have to remember that every single human being alive is our brother and sister. And we need to bring the brothers and sisters into the family, or at least create the opportunity for our brothers and sisters to come into the family. So the question is, how do we go about doing that? What should we do in order to achieve that? Well, that's where last week's parable comes in. So last week we had, again, the parable of the shrewd manager. And it turns out that these two parables were actually intended to work together, because as Luke documents what Jesus did, it turns out that Jesus actually told these two parables back to back. But he actually did it in the opposite order that we did it. He first told the parable of the lost son. And then he immediately begins the parable of the shrewd manager. And so the idea is that the lost son is meant to point out that we are responsible to help people connect with God. And then once we understand that fact, the shrewd manager tells us how we should go about doing that. Now again, remember, in the parable of the shrewd manager, how did he connect with people? Well, he did something a little sketchy, right? He kind of discounted his boss's items, actually kind of, in a way, almost stole some money. But if we step back away from that, what he did is he got creative. And he figured out ways to connect with people. He looked at people's lives and said, what are they struggling with? Well, remember, they were huge amounts of monies we were talking about. They're probably struggling to pay their bills. So let me help them pay their bills. And in that, they found connection, found relationship. He made friends by doing that. But what it really comes down to is that he got creative in connecting with people. And again, remember how the parable ends. The rich man had to admire the dishonest rascal for being so shrewd. He was shrewd because he looked at people's interests and needs and then found connection with people by doing that. And it's interesting, Jesus actually summarizes this parable in a statement. What he actually says is, it's true that the children of this world are more shrewd in dealing with the world around them than are the children of light. In other words, what he's saying is that, look around. How are people being successful in connecting with people? How are people in their businesses being successful in connecting with people? How are people who are just, making friends? How are they being successful in connecting with people? They're being creative. Use that kind of creativity to help people connect with God. That's exactly what he's calling us to do. He's calling us to evaluate the world around us and understand what people's interests are. Understand how people are concerned and what they're struggling with. Understand how people are hurting. And step into those opportunities to connect with people. Not because we want something from them, but because that's how you build relationships. That's how you care for people. That's how you demonstrate the love of God. And that's how God works through things to connect with people. So what he's saying is we need to meet people where they are and do what it takes to connect with people. What that means is we have to embrace change. And I get it, change is uncomfortable. I would love my life to stay exactly the same. But things change, and we've got to change with them. Which means we actually have to incorporate change into how we do things. Because the world is changing. And we are called to be a light into this world. Which means we have to do what it takes to connect with people. And what we have to do is we have to see the world the way it actually is, not the way we wish it was. The world has changed dramatically in the past several decades, and it has changed enormously in just the past decade. We need to look at the realities of this world and where are the opportunities to connect with people, the things we can do, the mediums we can use to connect with people, the resources we can use to connect with people. We have to keep the change as part of who we are. We have to incorporate change. And it has to be something that we continue to do, that we continue to evaluate the world around us and see what we can do to step in to people's lives. And again, I know that's not a comfortable idea. It's not a comfortable concept. But the thing I realized, again, by looking at Dunkin' Donuts, I wasn't just focused on donuts all week, I promise, all right? But I thought about this, is that the thing that was important to me about Dunkin' Donuts was coffee and donuts. Not a lot, but some. But if they only sold coffee and donuts, one day they would disappear. But because they added to what they had and they incorporated additional things that connected with people, these coladas and mochiatos and things I'll never drink, they now become a stronger organization. They now reach more people and they become capable of doing more. And because they've become stronger by reaching into more people's lives, that traditional thing that I like so much, coffee and donuts, will stick around for years to come. And so that's what we have to do as individual followers of Jesus, and it's certainly what we have to do as a church, is embrace and expand into change to protect what's already so important to us, but even beyond that, to grow the family of God. We live in a desperately hurting world. Desperately hurting world. And we know the one who really cares, and the one who transforms lives, and the one who reaches into where people are hurting and helps pull them out. It's our responsibility to share that, and there's an incredible joy in doing that. Let's step into it, and let's accept this responsibility to embrace change and be part of healing a hurting world.